So Cherub was born and raised in Guyana, and she has an interesting story about how she fell in love as a young child with the state of Israel. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what it was like to grow up in Guyana, how you came to know about Israel, and how your impressions of the Jewish state were formed as a young child?
Well, it was until I reached age 18 we started having television in Guyana on a commercial scale. There may have been one or two persons with television, but we didn't have that. So we read a lot. We listened to the radio, and I consumed every article in the newspapers, went to the library, and I read. And so I developed a love for Israel from my readings of various books as well as the Bible. And so we had a Bible study teacher in church who taught us about Israel and taught us how to love Israel, and that the Jewish people were chosen by God and are still God's chosen people. And so everything about the news, when I started paying attention, started sounding contrary to what we were being taught, that Israel is God's chosen people, Israel is loved by God. But when you hear the newscasts, there were conflicts. You heard about the Intifada, you heard about bombings. And so most people I know, most of my friends were always scared about the idea of the Middle East. Once you heard of the Middle East, you heard of conflicts. So when I said I was going to go to the Middle East one day, people thought, how would you go in such a dangerous place? But somehow my love for Israel grew and developed, and I started pursuing reading as much as I could. In those days, of course, they had no internet because I'm 51. And so we had no internet, but I would spend a lot of time in the library reading as many books as I could on Israel. And I developed a passion to the point where I felt I should make a difference. I'll join some and give some service in the international community. So I became a teacher, trained teacher, secondary trained, and then having finished training got two boys, two of my sons, with only two children, I felt the need to resign from teaching. So I resigned and I decided I'll become a journalist for a short period of time. So I worked with Mrs. Janet Jagan, who was a born Jew and was married to a Guyanese who became the president of Guyana. So I worked with her organization for about 7 months, and during that time they were processing my application for the Foreign Service. I joined the Foreign Service on December 23rd, 1995, or 96. I can't remember the exact date, but when I joined the Foreign Service, I was placed in the Multilateral and Global Affairs Department. And in that department, we were responsible for everything related to foreign policy, global affairs, multilateralism. So it incorporated the United Nations and other international organizations. And in our department, we were exposed to tremendous reading. Our boss used to just distribute reading materials. Whether you were doing anything to do with that or not, you had to read. And so I gained more information, more knowledge from the international perspective, reading materials in relation to international law. We had to do a program, a course. My first degree is in communication, journalism. My postgrad is in diplomacy, and my master's is in international relations. So in that program, we had to study international organizations, international relations. We had to deal with Egypt and the Middle East and other areas. So we were well trained and well prepared when they sent me to the United Nations in December 1999. In September, for the 3-month General Assembly. During that period of time, I sat on the Committee of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. I sat in NAM, that is the Non-Aligned Movement, First Committee, dealing with disarmament, Fourth Committee, dealing with the decolonization issues. And in all these committees, Israel was the focus or focal point. when it came to resolutions in the first committee, they would focus on the nuclear-free Middle East. They wanted the Middle East to be nuclear-free, so Israel would be singled out. When they talked about decolonization, Israel will be focused on, because Israel lives in its country and the Palestinian people would make claims to suggest that they are oppressed or they are occupied. Then in NAM is the non-aligned movement, there wasn't much discussion on Israel. But in the Committee of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, of course, they focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict all the way.
So we were talking earlier, if we can just go back a little bit. So you mentioned that you had befriended the woman who was actually Jewish, who ended up marrying the president of Guyana, and that's how you sort of forayed into the Foreign Service. So, and ironically, you said that was also the time that Guyana had joined the OIC, which is the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, which we know as the 57-member voting bloc at the General Assembly that has basically hijacked the General Assembly. Can you tell me a little bit, why would Guyana have any interest in joining the OIC at all?
When I met Mrs. Jagan, she was already married, and I met her through my working with her as a journalist for her newspaper. She was the first lady of Guyana, and she ran a newspaper, so I worked there while waiting to join the Foreign Service. After I joined, in the space of about 6 months, her husband passed away. He died while in office as the president of Guyana, Dr. Chedi Jagan. And soon after, Mrs. Jagan became the president of Guyana, and it was during her tenure as president, Guyana joined the OIC. Guyana is situated on the continent of South America and is the only English-speaking country there on the continent, but we align ourselves with the Caribbean, the Eastern and other Caribbean states. So we see ourselves as Caribbean people because we speak the same language, share the same historic culture with under the British experience. Mrs. Jagan and her team of advisors would have considered Suriname. Suriname and Venezuela had territorial disputes with Guyana. And in the case of Venezuela, we called it the border controversy. With Suriname, we called it dispute. They had claims with the waterway and things like that. I'm not so versed in the details of the controversy, but Suriname was a member of the OIC. Guyana, wanting to not allow Suriname to have leverage over her, being a part of an organization that she could garner more support over Guyana, Guyana became a member of that organization. Guyana has about 800,000 people, or under 800,000. And in our population, we have 3 different groups. We have the Indians that are split into 2. Indians are from India, and they're split into 2 religious groups, the Muslims and the Hindus. But the Muslims are a minority in that grouping, and then the Indians and the blacks. So the blacks being people like me, and the Indians who are descendants from India. But we are considered a people of 6 ethnic groups. And so, because we have the mixed race, the Europeans and the Chinese, all came, the rest of them came during the indentureship period. And we have gotten along. There are times they've had racial disputes between the blacks and the Indians. So, but I just want you to know, Guyana is not an Islamic country. Guyana is not a Muslim country. The Muslims are minority in terms of religious grouping in Guyana. They have more Hindus and they have more Christians. And even among the Indians, they have many of them, a good percentage of them who are Christians. So it was basically for political purposes Guyana joined the OIC. But Guyana does vote with the OIC as is required or expected as a member state of that organization.
And so do you think there's a chance now that you had mentioned earlier when we were in conversation before this event that the territorial disputes are dead in a sense. That it's no longer that big of a political issue, that Guyana could be persuaded to, even if it maintains its membership with the OIC, not to continually vote aligned with the OIC, especially on issues like the defamation of religion resolutions, which are passed every year that attempt to make it a crime in international law to defame Islam. And given that Guyana is not an Islamist state, do you think there would be a political will to not vote along with the OIC, especially because of all the vitriol against Israel at the OIC, or even to disassociate with it and give up its membership? Do you think that's a possibility?
I am not sure. Guyana and Suriname have the UN ruled by arbitration in their conflict. So there is not this simmering conflict that was at the time in the early 2000s and 50s and the 60s and the 70s and 80s. But Ghana may be persuaded in the next decade or so to change its policy. It has to do with who is elected, who is in office, and how much they have come to realize that being a part of the OIC may not be serving Ghana's national interests in the future. It has to do with changes and policy changes, and whether they believe that this relationship they have with the OIC may not be in their best interest in the future.
Mm-hmm. So there's an opportunity then, you would say, for a lobbying initiative to get Guyana out of the OIC. So you also mentioned in your dossier that when you first decided to participate as a diplomat and involve yourself in the international system, you had very high expectations from the United Nations. You felt that you were awakened and it was a dream come true. And then after serving at the United Nations, you've told me in conversations that the whole concept of multilateralism was a fraud when it came to Israel, and the whole purposes upon which the United Nations was established, after the two world wars to prevent conflict, has obviously not been realized. So, what were some of the key events during your service at the UN that contributed to this realization?
I believe the UN started off with very good intentions in 1945 when they were established as a body following the two world wars, no war again, never again. And then Israel was established as a state in 1948. You would all know that Israel did accept the partition plan in 1947, but the Palestinians, Arabs, they rejected the plan. Since then, they have maintained the conflict as though it were Israel's fault that they don't have a Palestinian state. Israel did accept the plan and establish a state as a Jewish state for the Jewish people, and did not throw out the Arab community. They allowed those who wanted to become Arab Israelis, take on Israeli nationality. In terms of citizenship, they were able to do so and still maintain their religious beliefs. Israel still accommodated them in training them, educating them. In fact, Ambassador Purser said today, the small percentage of Arabs that are free are the ones living in Israel. Now, when it came to the United Nations, I was always in love with the international system, and I believe that it had the original goal was to create peace around the world and to establish peace, see that this instrument could work toward securing peace. But when I got to the United Nations, I saw that the United Nations was hijacked by a community of people who had influence. In my mind, the influence came as a result of their natural resource, oil. They had money, and they were able to push an agenda that created hostility toward Israel. it's on the surface, it always seems, I can describe it this way. It seems, let's listen. When we listen, you hear them tell the story of the Palestinian conflict. If you don't have, in my case, I believe my biblical background preserved me from falling into believing the narrative that Israel is occupying the state and that Israel is doing this and the settlement activity is illegal and things like that. So for the person who doesn't have a biblical background, in my mind, they fall into having empathy, sympathy for the cause. When you hear them tell the story, you feel very drawn or sorry for what you're being told. And as a result, the international community goes along, in my mind, with the story, with the agenda, from what is portrayed to them at the time. When it comes to Israel's response, giving Israel a chance to respond, people after a while are out there having coffee, or they're just not interested in hearing Israel. They're told so often that Israel is an occupier. They're told so often about Israel's military might. They're not aware that Israel had to have a very strong defense force to protect her citizenry. They see Israel as the bully and these Palestinians as a victim.
So this narrative that's spread at the UN, you mentioned that you came to know about a unit called the Division for Palestinian Rights, and you sort of just stumbled upon it by chance. And so the purpose of this division, which was established by the UN General Assembly in 1977, is purely a PR arm for the so-called Palestinian Arabs to disseminate their message within the United Nations and sort of indoctrinate the diplomats there, so that, as I understand what you're saying, their narrative has so permeated that when it comes to Israel's opportunity to respond, as you mentioned, Ambassador Prosor responded today, even the diplomats, their ears are closed when their job is essentially to be diplomatic and to consider all sides and to engage in a open conversation within the United Nations.
Yes, in 2004 to 2005, for 4 months, I served as an intern at the United Nations while reading for my master's, and the department in which I served I was assigned to the First Committee Bureau. And one day the boss said to us that we must go upstairs to look at some designs they had for the cubicles. So when I went up to the first floor it may have been, I walked into this division I never knew existed. So
just because you were checking out what the cubicle divisions were that she was supposed to bring down to her floor, that you stumbled upon this division that I know took up half the floor.
The cubicles could not be removed. They were a new design. They were put in instead of walls. They were using these cubicles. So when I got up there, I saw this division, and I went to them and I asked them for all the documents they had, a copy of every document, and they all were, of course, pro-Palestinian and not at any time in any way pro-Israel or saying anything positive about Israel. And so this unit, they helped serve the Committee of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. They have prepared the documentation. They helped with the meetings that took place in the last few days on the question of Palestine. This is where Ambassador Prosor spoke to the question about accusing Israel all the time. Yesterday, he addressed the UN General Assembly in relation to the matter. But they provide assistance, and this is at the UN. It's in the Secretariat, it's housed in the UN, and most likely funded by the member states of the United Nations. And I just want to hastily touch on something that really disturbed me during the 50-day conflict with Hamas. The UN buildings that were used to house weapons, and the UN General Assembly or the UN Secretariat itself seemed to not want to deal with the situation and come out and criticize Hamas or the Arabs or the Palestinian community as much as they readily criticize Israel. So you can see over and over again the deck is stacked against Israel. Every time Israel pursues the defense for her own national security interests, preserving her people, building homes, creates a big issue with regard to the United Nations, regard to the EU, how they come out and criticize Israel. And the UN, we must remember, comprises member states, 193 member states. They are the United Nations. We are the United Nations. We are the people of the United Nations. So when we speak of the United Nations, we're speaking about the people, the diplomats, the representatives, the national interests of the countries, their domestic and foreign policies. These are the things that determine how they relate to Israel at the United Nations, how they relate to the Palestinian people. Because if your domestic policy tells you that the Palestinian people are victims, then you'll pursue that in your foreign policy. If you are told that Israel is an apartheid state, then you will seek the liberation of the Palestinians at the United Nations. Whatever you conceive in your mind from the your national perspective, you will come with that. Your diplomats will be trained, will be housed, will be schooled, will be told what to pursue. So to me, to deal with the United Nations, you have to really lobby and work with the nationals, the countries, the home capitals before the diplomats come there. Develop good relationships. And I've seen Israel really try in building bridges, building gaps in Africa. Right now, in the last few months, I know Israel was there working with the nurses and doctors, the medical personnel in some of these countries to train them how to combat Ebola, how to protect themselves from the spread of Ebola. I knew when Israel was the first to arrive in Haiti, when they had an earthquake. And so if Israel continues, and I know Israel has been reaching out to member states and building bilateral relations with these countries, they will help in her struggles in the United Nations.
So is it working? I mean, the aid that Israel gives, the medical aid or the other aid when it comes to those disasters, medical disasters or natural disasters, do you think that's changing the national perspective of the general population of these African countries? Or is it does the local media compete with that? You mentioned when you were growing up, you were listening to the radio and to the news in Guyana, and it was very anti-Israel. You know, what is the Guyanese national perspective? Or in general, what do the people there think of the state of Israel?
The news in Guyana at the time wasn't anti-Israel in that they just reported what was happening. They reported there was a conflict or there is a conflict or something. In Guyana, most of the people I know, because of the church, the people there are very religious. And from the church's perspective, they have been teaching support for Israel, or they teach in their Sunday schools and Bible studies about Israel being in their homeland, because this is the place where David built Jerusalem. This is the place where Jacob lived. This is the place where all the Bible characters that we have come to admire, they lived there. And so in the national religious perspective, omitting the Muslims, is the churches and the church people do support Israel. Now, I don't know, I haven't lived in Guyana for the last 13 years, so I don't know if there's a change in that stance, but throughout the Caribbean, when I relate to Caribbean people, they always feel it's a handoff approach. I don't know too much about it, I don't understand the subject, let me leave it alone. So that is education. Is very vital in the Caribbean and elsewhere to support Israel. They need to know that Israel is not occupying Palestinian land. And most times people say, I don't know, I don't understand it, and they back away. But if they get an understanding, if they get to have more fora where they can have exchanges and meet with Jews, then they don't know that the Jewish people are lovely. I've had to say to them, because I spent 3 months in Israel, that the Jewish people are normal people. They love the same things like we do. They dance, they sing, they don't know. Because of the pictures that have been formulated about Israel and the Jewish people, they don't have a clue who the Jewish people really are, that they're ordinary folk. I said to a friend the other day, the Jews go to bed, waking up the next morning, desiring the same things like us. They desire to wake up, you know, and not be killed while sleeping. So if they could get an opportunity to meet with more Jewish people, interact with them, hear their stories, I think people's perspective would change. But because of every time they hear about Israel, they hear of war, and then they hear the narrative that the babies are being killed. See what is happening? Women are crying, and you see that. They tend to not understand, because not everybody is like me. I spend about 12 hours a day reading and studying materials related to Israel. They're busy, they're not following the news and seeing that Hamas is using these people as human shields. That is not resonating. They haven't heard that in most of the cases of people I've spoken to. So now I have to tell them that Hamas is using these people as human shields. They're planting their weapons near schools or hiding their missiles in the school building. And then they say, how is that possible? So we, the Jewish people, I'm saying we, as including me, we need to have information go out there, just as bombarding people, telling the Jewish narrative, telling the stories, telling the reality, because people just don't know.
So on that note, 2 questions. So since your service at the United Nations, you've basically taken it upon yourself to go about and sort of be this one-woman powerhouse that is lobbying members of Congress, that is on an education campaign. Tell us a little bit about that. Tell us about your experience in Florida, for example. Tell us about the reception that you've had when you've been traveling around the world and the United States, attempting to educate people as to what the true narrative is in the Middle East.
Very well. In 2009, I spent 9 months traveling. I visited London, and I interviewed a lot of Arab diplomats there. In New York, same. Washington, same.
Tell us about some of the diplomats.
Ambassador from Jordan, the deputy ambassador in New York, the deputy ambassador in Egypt, of Egypt in Washington, the Palestinian ambassador representative here in New York, Libya, Turkey in London. I've interviewed non-political people as well, people in journalism, people in academia, like Professor Aman in Jerusalem. I interviewed a whole number of persons to write the book. Now, in 2011, I was following the news story where President Abbas wanted to unilaterally declare a Palestinian state. He wanted the UN to just declare this state without negotiation or completing negotiations with Israel. Israel had signed the Oslo Peace Accord, and in it, they had incorporated language that this conflict must be resolved by way of bilateral negotiations or even multilateral. Once it included the US, it would then be multilateral. But Abbas and his team had decided they will get UN to support them without going by way of negotiating with Israel. The US had opposed it. So I took it upon myself from the January of 2011 to start doing research online and start writing lawmakers in various states across the US. And then I gathered a list, And I began in Washington, D.C. I attended the CUFI meeting. I know you must have heard about CUFI with John Hagee. And they did work. We did lobbying for 2 days or 1 day, all of 1 day. And then from there, I went alone to Virginia, where I met with about 20 lawmakers. Then I moved on from Virginia to Texas. Even though Texas, they don't meet all year like in other places, they meet once every 4 years or thereabout. I did get to meet with lawmakers and aides. Then came back to Illinois, met with Senator Ira Silverstein. In fact, in Illinois, I had a very interesting story. Many of the lawmakers told me that Senator Silverstein, he drafts the bills. So they would say to me, tell him I support, tell him I will support. And these were not all Jewish lawmakers. Then I went to Florida, and then I came to New York.
So what you were doing is you were lobbying for Congress to pass a bill that
these different states,
its solidarity,
yes.
each state to express its solidarity with the state of Israel.
Yes.
Okay.
So from there I came to Florida, and one day I had my speaking notes that my mentor Moshe Amon had vetted, and I'm going through my speaking notes encouraging her to, this is State Representative Lori Brennan. I asked her to support Israel, and I'm telling her all the things and the reasons why she needs to support Israel, and a bill, co-sponsor bill in the Florida State House. And when I'm done, she looks at me, she said, are you Jewish? I said, no, I'm a Christian. She said, I am a Jew, and look at what you're doing. I'm supposed to be doing what you're doing. I said, well, at least you could tell the Jewish people there's somebody out there who is standing in support with them and that you have approved. And so I made friends with a number of persons. I met with Senator Ball from New York, upstate, and various places. Everybody was very supportive. I met with blacks, I met with whites, and Jews and non-Jews, and they were all saying, yes, we will support anything our house comes up with, we will support. In total, I met with over 78 to 80, including a handful of aides, and the others were mostly about 60, 65 lawmakers themselves. And this was just an independent exercise, and I was very pleased. At the end of the time, I don't think I had much to do with it, but they didn't have any resolution put forward granting or considering a Palestinian state that year. And we know right now there is some hesitancy on the part of the Palestinians whether to go forward and when to go forward, as against waiting and negotiating with Israel. And I believe the one reason why the Palestinians will not negotiate a two-state solution with Israel is because they believe, as you know, according to their religious beliefs, once Islam has been in any territory at any point in history, it becomes the domain of Islam. So as far as they're concerned, this is Islamic State. Despite the fact they know, and I believe many of them are well aware of the fact, Israel had its historic homeland there, and Israel by right is entitled to a historic homeland. They don't want to negotiate a peace treaty or a resolution that would say we acknowledge Israel's right to exist. There's no Arab, no Palestinian who's going to do that. No leader.
And so the two-state solution, you've told me, basically is a euphemism for Israel's destruction. And,
yes.
and you know, that's not the end goal. So when you were speaking with the Arab diplomats from Jordan or Egypt, you know, how would they describe to you what this so-called two-state solution is when you were doing the interviews for your book?
Well, Jordan did say to me they had a peace treaty with Israel in 1994, and Egypt did acknowledge their treaty with Israel. But the two countries had a different approach at the time in 2009 as to how they related to Israel. Jordan felt that they could continue to have very strong bilateral ties with Israel. They could develop their water and other interests. But Egypt at the time felt that we did it to Israel in 1973 when we took Israel by surprise and we had that war. And so we came to the table as Egypt saw itself that prior to that conflict, in the Yom Kippur War, they were the underdog. But because they took Israel by surprise, they now came to the table as a strong partner. Egypt did not say to me how much pressure the U.S. put on Israel to return the Sinai. Two is Egypt. Egypt made it sound as though we just got it as a result of negotiating, and our strength, we became much stronger because we took Israel by surprise. And Egypt told me that that was the same strategy the Palestinians were using to constantly wear away at Israel, beat Israel down with these skirmishes and these conflicts, that one day Israel is going to be so weakened, Israel is going to come to the table and just say yes to everything, just give in, you know. So the two countries saw their relationship with Israel differently. Jordan saw that there is a future in its relationship with Israel, whereas Egypt saw it as one of these days the Palestinians are going to conquer Israel and perhaps the Arab world as well.
When you were serving at the United Nations also, were you trying to engage in any outreach within the organization, and what kind of response did you get from other diplomats when you were attempting to educate them?
While at the UN, I used to reach out to the Israeli delegates. I would go up to them and engage them and talk with them and introduce myself to them and just say, hi, I'm Cherub, I'm looking at you and following your concerns.
How about the non-Israeli delegates, though, when you were going to the other nations who were hostile to Israel? Was there any type of outreach from your embassy or from you personally while you were at the United Nations, or were you just more observing what was going on?
I did not try to influence another delegation on my personal commitments, personal views concerning Israel. My friends knew my position, but I never reached out beyond my, outside of any, to any delegate of any country. What I was asked to do one year, in 1999, I did address the UN General Assembly. I was one of the youngest persons to ever have addressed the General Assembly, and it was on the question of Palestine. And when I drafted this speech, I tried to bring in Israel, put Israel in a very positive light. And I was very pleased to see my ambassador talking about peace. He incorporated an entire paragraph hoping that one day there could be peace for the Israelis and the Palestinians. That is as much as I personally did there. But after I left the UN, I felt I had the liberty, after I left my country's diplomatic service, to join my husband, who works in the Bahamas. I felt then I was free. So I could talk with everybody and anybody and didn't have to think about national interests or conflict of interest. And so since then, that is what I've been doing. The lobbying work, the interviews, the consultations, the going and talking with people, that I've done on my own time and with my own resources.
Thank you. So let's open it up to some questions. So just to repeat the question, the gentleman mentioned that Israel has been giving aid and disaster relief with no quid pro quo. For many years, it's not a recent phenomenon, and yet Israel has very few friends at the United Nations, and the best hope that we can have when it comes to an anti-Israel vote is to abstain. So are there any examples that you've witnessed where there's been pressure on countries to abstain from voting against Israel?
Well, where countries would like to oppose these anti-Israel resolutions.
Okay.
but they've been pressured.
Right. So where these countries who've received aid want to actually oppose anti-Israel resolutions, but they've been pressured, whether it be by the OIC, to vote in line to against Israel, basically.
At the time when I served at the UN, the strongest voice for Israel was the United States. And the United States, with her embassies around the world, could exert influence and pressure, or used to, through her diplomats and diplomatic representatives in the various countries. As of now, I know in the Israel, there were 3 countries that voted as one: Marshall Islands, Israel, and the United States. They would all vote as one. Most time, it was always necessary for them to vote no. So the 3 will vote together. Then they had the rest of the voting bloc. A few states, a lot of Caribbean states, CARICOM countries, would vote by abstaining. There may be some European countries, including Great Britain, depending on what the resolution is, they would abstain. And generally everybody else voted voted yes. I don't know what may have gone on behind the scenes in the capitals and sometimes at the ambassadorial level in New York. But it's necessary for the member states that have benefited from Israel's humanitarian assistance, and they've seen Israel as a giver, and they have received, and their people have had long life or food on the table or something. It is necessary for them to remember and do pay attention to the fact that Israel is under a lot of pressure and is isolated, so that they could refrain from participating in this isolation by abstaining as if they don't want to vote no. Perhaps Israel could also, I would probably suspect that Israel is lobbying these countries when it comes to these resolutions, because the resolutions tend to come up, you know they're coming up, and you know when they're there, and they can lobby directly and indirectly to these member states. But as I said, very often the country's domestic policy is already set. And so their foreign policy comes out of their domestic policy, and they just move along. And sometimes a particular government in a country would have benefited, say the Red Party would have received so much aid from Israel in a country called La La Land. But then the Red Party was voted out and the Blue Party is in. When the Blue Party may decide, based on who comes along and says what to them, that, okay, we'll change our policy and vote now with this group. So these are some of the dynamics that take place behind the scenes.
So given that there's so many states within the United Nations that are anti-Israel, Israel can really only count on 2 nations to support. Do you think it's worth Israel maintaining its membership?
I think so. Israel at least could say what is on her heart and her mind when they have these issues. Israel could come out and condemn. For example, Ambassador Prosser said yesterday, "I accuse you of hypocrisy. I accuse you of duplicity. I accuse you of lending legitimacy to those who seek to destroy our state." At least Israel could raise an alarm, can criticize, can be a voice for her own state. If she's not there, there's nobody who's going to be there to do it.
Why do you think the Europeans are so pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian?
I don't know if it started in the 60s when the Europeans stopped making as many children, And so they needed a labor force, and they started allowing this wave of Muslim Arab community to come into Europe. And they met the Jewish people and the Europeans there, and they've been born there now. And so I believe Europe is at the crossroads. And there is a time that is going to come where Europe is either would have to decide, is it an Islamic grouping, or if they're still secular, because they're not Christians anymore. So Europe has a large number of Muslims, and I don't think they want to upset the apple cart. For some strange reason, I saw just about 3 weeks ago there was an uprising in Sweden. Who would think of Sweden, you know, people in riot gear and things like that? So the face of Europe is changing. When I was in London, I asked, where are the white people? I was seeing dark-skinned, straight-hair people, and they seem to be everywhere. And so, as a result, Europe is trying to push harder than everybody else for a two-state solution, for a Palestinian state. Believe it, when there is a Palestinian state, there wouldn't be a problem in our country. You know, we wouldn't have conflicts with them. They would just rest in peace. But I don't think the goal for the Palestinian people is to stop there. When we look at ISIS, they're not determining, after we get all of Israel, that we would just lay back on our laurels and live in peace and security with the rest of the world. That is not the end game.
So the question is, do you think what ISIS is now doing, the sheer brutality of their persecution of the minorities, and the publicity of that, is that impacting at all what's going on at the United Nations? And can some education initiative telling the world about exactly what you were just talking about, ISIS's goals to establish the caliphate, do you think that would be helpful at all when it comes to educating the world about the enemies, I guess, that Israel faces and the entire West faces, which is those that are theologically based terrorists?
I would tell you that the world sees Israel, Hamas, Palestine separate and apart from ISIS. For me, they're the same. But they have divided up mentally, or at least theoretically, ISIS here and Hamas, Palestine, Israel here. The reason it is convenient or expedient for them to do it that way, because this is a territorial conflict. Israel is in the land, and we need to make peace by giving the Palestinians this territory. ISIS, well, they're the bad guys. They're not really Islamic. They're just there creating trouble for Islam and for the rest of the world. That's how they see it. You know, so having split the two groups, they don't see, there's no matching in terms of the relationship, so they deal with them separately. Ambassador Prosser said yesterday that there's been no select committee established to investigate ISIS, to investigate the expulsion of Christians and minority groups in the Middle East at the hands of ISIS and the slaughter. But if something should have happened in Israel, of course there'll be a select committee. So the world is treating the two groups and the two circumstances as though they're not matching, they don't have any relationship at all.
So what is the likelihood that we can get Guyana on board to the coalition that either abstains or votes in support of Israel?
I think the likelihood is very strong, is very worth the effort trying. You know, I think it's worth the effort, and the positions put forward and the cares and concerns raised could certainly give the leadership pause and something to consider. They may say, well, certain things we might support Israel on and some things we may not. But the point is to get them to listen to you and get them to reconsider. And I think with private talks, you can make a headway.
What would the backlash be, though? I mean, if all of a sudden Guyana stops voting with the OIC, they might get kicked out of the OIC. What would the backlash against Guyana be? Why would it be not in their interests?
I really don't think Guyana has economic gains to get from being a member of the OIC. We buy oil from Venezuela and Trinidad, so we're not dependent on oil from the Middle East. We're pretty independent in that part of the world, being in South America. So barring economic interests and things like that, I really don't think Guyana stands to lose much. For me, the important thing in diplomacy is to try. And there is always an once the opportunity presents itself, it's always worth the while making the effort, listening. They may say, well, but at least you would have done your best. But I think overall, the Caribbean, at least, with much more direct contact with Jewish people, they could have a totally different posture toward Israel than ever before.
When Israel gets up and gives a speech like Ambassador Prosser did today, what is the reaction of the other diplomats? Do they take it seriously? Do they not pay attention? What's going on in the minds of the other diplomats?
I know they're not laughing, and I know the Arabs are not laughing. They're listening. They're making notes. They're following. And if ever they get a chance to respond, they raise their flag to respond. And then is when it becomes like, it may not happen in the General Assembly, but in a committee, then is when it becomes contentious, because they want to respond and say what it is, or they set up the Palestinians to respond. And then it goes back and forth. I've actually seen that happen, 5 minutes to you, 5 minutes to you, and then come back and forth. So they're not laughing. They seriously want to hear what Israel has to say and respond. At least in the Middle Eastern member states and the Muslims, they would be there trying to figure out so that they could try to sell or change the narrative to suit their position. The other member states, very often, because of instructions they would have received from Capitol, just wait for the time to vote and pretty much go along with what their instructions are.
So why don't we see more of the Christian community speaking out against the horrific genocidal slaughter of Christians in Syria and in Iraq, whereas you have the Presbyterian Church come out so virulently against Israel? You don't see the same type of passion when it comes to their own people, advocating for the civil rights and the human rights of their own people, killed at the hands of Islamists. Why is that?
I have asked myself the question many times, and especially given the influence of the U.S. In the world and the U.S. churches. The U.S. has most mega churches. I've asked myself, and I have come up to the conclusion they don't want to sound as though they're being political. They're politicized. That's my interpretation to the silence, which is deafening and sends me crazy. And that is why I decided at least I could do something by raising funds to help these people. I figure they're looking to see what, if they were to speak out, if it would please Washington or displease Washington. And so they just move along quietly and don't be overt in their discourse. They may be saying things quietly. And in the outside of America, I know there are a number of churches that are praying. When I was here in New York in May, I attended a church with a friend, and her church prayed for the people often. But as to the outcry, the thing to stand by them and let the people know, because they're not aware that we even know what they're going through. There is this silence, and I could only conclude that the silence stems from the fact that they may think it may sound political, and they don't want to get into politics. And also, I don't know if they're fearful of ISIS. I don't know if they're thinking if they should speak out, ISIS may put them on some blacklist and threaten their lives. I really don't know. But as you mentioned, the Presbyterian, and they have been leading the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement. And it is time for others, including the Presbyterian, to come out and speak up against this. But I pray that we would start hearing voices very soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Just to mention once again, so Cherub is here with her books. She's happy to sign them. 50% of the proceeds go to the 2 charities that we mentioned before. And thank you again for coming today.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.